guess we can go on to the next section. Let me apologize, lots of statistics. Lots of statistics in this section. All right, so September 11th, 1973, the CIA worked with Augusto Pinochet, who was a general in Chile, to overthrow Salvador Allende, who was the elected president, who was a Marxist. You know, the military seized the government, rounded up 20,000 communists and socialists, and detained them in the National Sports Stadium, torturing lots of them, killing them. Just a really horrendous episode, and still to this day, I mean, it's had a huge impact on Chile, which I'll get into later. But you know, it was a big dramatic event when you saw the Chilean government just violently overthrown with the help of the CIA, and instead, you know, replaced with Augusto Pinochet, who is declaring himself the military dictator. Now, Milton Friedman, who was at that point at the University of Chicago with his Chicago School of Economics, they called them the Chicago Boys, they were flown to Chile to be the economic advisors. So immediately, Friedman is there, and he's working with Pinochet. They cut all government spending, except the military, by 10%. They legalized forms of financial speculation that had not been legal before. They lifted all price controls, and that was very important because at that point in Chile, the price of food was very closely regulated. There were heavy price controls on food. He allowed unlimited foreign imports, no tariffs, nothing. You know, total free trade. And then he had a policy of killing labor union activists and leftists. So you know, there were not many strikes and protests going on because you got killed or disappeared. One thing they would do is they would dump the bodies of people who'd been killed, leftists who'd been disappeared, in the streets. There's a lot of pictures of dead bodies of leftists. You know, someone would be known to be a communist or whatever, and then their body would show up in the street a couple weeks later, you know, just as kind of a message like, you know, don't be a communist, don't be a leftist. You know, the other thing is that, and there was a huge underground Marxist movement. Like people would talk about, like they would, you know, they would, on the roof of buildings, they would have stacks of leaflets like tied with string, and they would like light a candle and then run away, and then the, you know, when the candle burned, the paper would break, and then the leaflets would scatter and fall from the building, and people would collect it. And there was a widespread underground resistance to the Pinochet government. But yeah, it was pretty brutal. If you were a leftist or a Marxist, you were killed. That was pretty much their policy. And the result was 20 to 30% unemployment. They laid off the government workers in big numbers, and also you had, you know, all these domestic companies now were competing with products coming in from all over the world, so they went out of business. You had 117,000 industrial jobs eliminated. But more importantly, and this is really one of the most shocking things about Pinochet's government in Chile, is the price of food skyrocketed. The average family was spending roughly 74% of their income on food. Can you imagine 74% of your income on food? Like, what do you have left for rent? The average calorie intake dropped to less than 1,200 calories. Now, the school milk program, that was one of Allende's programs, is they were giving kids milk in school, right? Well, they eliminated it. And there was widespread instances of children fainting in school from lack of food. And there was a lot of children who just dropped out of school because they couldn't be in school. And there was a huge epidemic of homeless children. That became a big thing. Now, the Organization of the American States actually commissioned a study because there was so much child malnutrition going on in Chile at this time that they wanted to see what the effects were. And they were actually able to document that if children don't eat properly, they will lose their motor skills and they will not be able to walk, and that they will become permanently mentally disabled. And there are a number of people in Chile to this day who were malnourished as children during the aftermath of the Pinochet coup, and as a result, they are mentally disabled. The other thing is that, you know, when the economy, the overall economy is in this bad of a state, an underground economy emerges. So the drug trade escalated and child prostitution escalated in big numbers, right? People have to find a way to survive, and if the economy, the real economy collapses, an underground economy emerges. Now, interestingly, advocates of neoliberalism will often say that there was a Chilean economic miracle, and that it was just this economic miracle, and that he saved Chile, and it was so amazing. Milton Friedman went in there and he saved Chile. That's not the case. You know, Pinochet took power in 1973, September 11, 1973. The result, mass unemployment, mass malnutrition, 375% inflation. Then, you know, things continued to get worse. You know, you had between 20 and 30% employment until the 1982 financial crash, right? And that the speculative markets, he'd legalized all this, you know, all this speculation in the stock markets. They ultimately crashed in 1982. And at that point, Pinochet was tired of listening to Milton Friedman because clearly the economy wasn't going too well. And the Pinochet government began changing its policies. They renationalized some industries, and they began trying to stabilize the economy. The stabilization and the growth, that people describe as the Chilean economic miracle didn't really come about until 1988. So this is a long time after Milton Friedman's in Chile. And even then, poverty remains at 45%. So yes, the GDP is rising by the mid-80s, things are stabilizing, corporations are making profits, but you still have a huge rate of poverty. And still today, you have a lot of poverty in Chile. The middle class that had been created in the 50s and 60s was largely decimated. It's still there to some extent. It's actually interesting, the National Association of Manufacturers, which is not a liberal organization, those are not, socialists or communists, those are, pretty right-wing free market folks. The president of it, he said that what happened in Chile under Milton Friedman was one of the greatest failures of economic history, right? So this idea that Chile is an economic miracle, it just doesn't pan out. Now, one thing, I'll throw this in there, is that, when Milton Friedman was confronted about the fact that he worked with this brutal military dictatorship, his response was, well, eventually Pinochet was overthrown, and that proves that capitalism leads to democracy. Right? And so I had to do what I did in order to, and free markets eventually create democracy. So, that was his argument. And actually, Pinochet was removed by a widespread mass democratic uprising, protests, people in the streets fighting back, and the people leading it, surprisingly, were the underground socialists and communists in a lot of cases. So, but after the coup in Chile, you had, the populist leader Isabel Perón. In Argentina, she was removed by a coup by her military. They brought in Chicago school economists. The military dictatorship in Brazil also started following. Uruguay followed them, and that was kind of widespread. It started out in the southern cone with Chile and then Argentina, and it started spreading all throughout Latin America in the 1980s. Now, you get an individual in 1985 named Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University, and he's a little bit different than Milton Friedman. Now, Jeffrey Sachs, he is from Columbia University, and in 1985, Bolivia has an election, and he moves in and he becomes an advisor to the new government. And they're able to carry out a lot of the similar policies where they privatize things very quickly, and by 1987 they're having 25% to 30% unemployment, mass layoffs, wages go down by 40%, the number of people with jobs with retirement pensions goes down by 61%, so they're getting rid of the pensions of people who were working. Eventually in 1995, the Bolivian president auctions off the state industries at a hotel, and it's kind of like a carnival atmosphere, and he's selling off the oil and the railways and the phone companies, and the price of water goes up by 300%. But what's different about Jeffrey Sachs is Jeffrey Sachs was able to carry out Pinochet-style economic reforms without a big, brutal military dictatorship. There was no war in Bolivia. There was no, military junta seizing power. He's able to carry out Pinochetism without Pinochet, right? And so that's why he's widely praised. And, the economy does start to improve. The GDP is going up, poverty is increasing, wages are going down, but people are making profits. It's not a huge economic disaster. So Jeffrey Sachs, he's kind of the superstar of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and he becomes kind of the superstar. And he hangs out more with liberals, like, the Democratic Party. He's not an extreme right-winger. He's more considered a liberal. And he makes friends with a Hungarian billionaire by the name of George Soros. People have heard of George Soros. Now, George Soros is a Hungarian billionaire, and one of the main things George Soros did was he funded protest movements in Eastern Europe against communist governments. The Solidarity movement in Poland, a group of workers who were striking to the Roman Catholic dock workers didn't like the communist government. Well, they're being funded by Soros. Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia, various anti-communist artists in the Soviet Union. Soros is, paying them. Soros is a liberal. I mean, he's very liberal-minded, but, he doesn't like communism. And he's working with the US CIA to help kind of coordinate these protests all over Eastern Europe to help bring down the Marxist governments. And we know the Soviet Union fell in the fall of the Soviet Union, and he's paying a lot of these protests and supporting them. And he's a friend of Jeffrey Sachs, and he actually pays for Jeffrey Sachs' travel across Europe. Whenever Jeffrey Sachs, as communist governments are falling, Jeffrey Sachs comes in, and his airline tickets are paid for by George Soros. And interestingly, in the mid-90s, George Soros actually starts to question. He doesn't believe in free markets and neoliberalism anymore. He starts to say, well, he's for more of a Keynesian model, and he backs away from all of this after he'd been the main sponsor of Jeffrey Sachs throughout the early 90s. And so then in 1993 in Russia, you have the constitutional crisis. The Soviet Union has fallen, they have their first election in Russia, and they elect a communist majority to the parliament. And the communist majority, it's Yuganov, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, they're trying to stop Boris Yeltsin from implementing free market reforms, from selling off state industries, from privatizing things. So at that point, Yeltsin then uses his power in the Constitution to dissolve the parliament, right? And to just say, nope. So, you know, the communists who are elected to the parliament say, well, we're not going to leave. So at that point, you know, people pour out into the streets. There's a big mobilization of people to defend the parliament. The military is sent in to clear the parliament. 187 people are killed. It's just a mess, right? The constitutional crisis of 1993 in Russia. And now you would think, and I wanted to throw this in there, you would think that while something like this was happening in the former Soviet Union, while, you know, elected socialists and communists are being kicked out and are defending their right to be in the parliament, you would think that Marxists, especially all over the Western world, would be out in the streets supporting their comrades, right? That didn't happen. In fact, all over the Western left, this memo got sent out that because the Communist Party of the Russian Federation was aligning with a lot of Slavic nationalists and right-wingers, that this was a, quote, red-brown alliance. And they were saying this is a fascist gathering, this is a red-brown alliance. And there was very little solidarity. There were a couple protests in support of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, but very little. And there was this saying that if you know, this feeling among Western leftists that if you go out and support the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, you're supporting anti-Semitism, you're supporting fascism, you're supporting Russian nationalism, and there was very little solidarity with the Communist Party of the Russian Federation during the constitutional crisis in 1993. And so, of course, Jeffrey Sachs comes in, and he's the advisor to Boris Yeltsin. So he comes in, privatization, selling off state assets. 80% of Russian farms go bankrupt. 70,000 state factories close down. And what's interesting is a lot of these state factories, you know, they're sold, and, you know, Western companies buy them, American companies buy them, and just shut them down. And what's that about? Well, because if they're producing, they're in competition. Right? And at this point, you know, as the farms are going bankrupt, as the factories are going bankrupt, Russia starts importing huge amounts of products and food, especially from the United States. So the farms are going bankrupt and all that. So they're buying American food, they're buying American products. You know, in 1989, before the fall of the Soviet Union, there were around 2 million people in the country that were in poverty. By 1996, that number is 72 million. A 70 million people go into poverty. 1 in 4 Russians are living in poverty at that point. 37 million are living in conditions described as desperately poor. The number of drug users, this is according to the Russian Ministry of Drugs, increases by 900%, right? The suicide rate doubles. And overall, they lose 10% of their population. Now, it's not just people dying, it's also people just fleeing the country and moving somewhere else. And economist Andrei Gunder-Frank calls it economic genocide, you know. And actually, and this quote, I actually was in the room when he said it because he was speaking at NYU. Bill Bradley, the former senator, he was there and he was going over there with the Clinton administration, and he said 30% unemployment, rampant inflation, pensions gone, savings gone, 30 or 40 years it's all gone, no jobs, a few people doing very well who bought all the assets from the state, but the average person, no. That's how he described, this is U.S. Senator Bill Bradley, how he described what was going on there in the 1990s. But it's not just, you know, it's not just Russia, it's all the former socialist countries. And a couple examples, in 1994, in the Ukrainian city of Lviv, you have running water and electricity for only a few hours in the morning and the evening, because they have so little money, they can't afford to keep the lights on, they can't afford to keep the water running. The average life expectancy in Russia goes down by about 3 years during this time. A 50% increase in the price of food in the city of Prague in 1989 to 1990. And what's interesting is, you know, during the time of the Soviet Union was prevented from importing a lot of Western products, right? Like bananas and, you know, Coca-Cola and all of that. And people, you know, they tell stories about people in the Soviet Union. They would keep like a little Coke can, and it was like a treasure. This is, you know, the glorious West. I've got my little treasure here. But now, all over Eastern Europe, you can buy Coke, and you can buy bananas, and you can buy all these products. I mean, they're on the store, they're on the shelf in the store, but people can't afford to buy them. You know, I mean, people don't have the money. And people are fleeing in big numbers. There was a huge rise in human trafficking, sex trafficking during this time. You know, heroin is all over there. It's just a disastrous time for Eastern Europe as they're implementing all these free market reforms. Also in the 1990s, you have the rise of, you know, what you might call globalist institutions. The World Trade Organization is founded. So the World Trade Organization is a trade deal that essentially the economic laws that you pass in your country are subject to review by the World Trade Organization. So there's a group of people appointed by corporations, and if you want to raise the minimum wage in your country, or if you want to regulate spending or whatever, you have to go to the World Trade Organization, and they can approve or disapprove of it and fine your country if you do it in a way they don't approve of. The International Criminal Court is set up in 2002, something Soros really campaigned hard for. They've so far indicted 39 people. Every single one of them is African. Among them are a number of the leaders of the Libyan government of Muammar Gaddafi that have been indicted. Every single one of them has been indicted. And the International Criminal Court is set up in the aftermath of the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. And it's set up in which they're, after the destruction of Yugoslavia, they're bringing in all the leaders of the former socialist government there and charging them. Interestingly, now the UN Charter is adjusted to include the phrase responsibility to protect. The UN Charter allowed no violations of the sovereignty of any country. But advocates of neoliberalism worked very, very hard, including Samantha Power and others, to get added to the UN Charter this phrase responsibility to protect, where if people's lives are in danger, it's okay to infringe on the sovereignty of the country, right? Libya, that's a sovereign country, but they said Gaddafi was killing people, so NATO was allowed to go and bomb the country and overthrow the government. Serbia was the first example of responsibility to protect being implemented, but it's been used all around the world. Humanitarian intervention is now allowed according to the UN Charter under this change. And we've had our share of neoliberalism here in the United States. There's the Taft-Hartley Law, for example. That was passed in the aftermath of the Second World War, 1948. Solidarity strikes. If you're in a workplace and you want to go on strike, by law, it must be about something in your workplace. You can't have a solidarity strike with people in other workplaces. It used to be unionized, they had what they called card check, which is that, if half the people, 51% of the company, people working there, agreed to be represented by a union, the union represented them. Not anymore. Now they have the National Labor Relations Board process where it can take up to 2 years, and it's a long process. This also, interestingly, allows the president, the Taft-Hartley law, to order striking workers back to work for a cooling off period. So there's a strike at a company, it's extreme, so he says, you know what, the president can just say, well, you all have to go back to work for up to 2 years for a cooling off period. We're going to let things cool off, right? Basically allows the president to prevent strikes. It's a very, very anti-labor law, and there's been a lot of talk of repealing it. There was proposals. Obama said he was going to pass what he called the Employee Free Choice Act, which was going to repeal the Taft-Hartley law. He seemed to have forgotten about that as soon as he took office. But we also have, private prisons and military contractors and charter schools. This is a big point that Milton Friedman really pushes in his book Free to Choose and his mini-series. Why have the government do something? Because a private corporation can always do it better, right? So why, when we have prisons, right? When criminals get arrested and put in prisons, why have them be run by the government? Why not have a private company that gets paid, money to lock people in jail? What could possibly go wrong with that, right? Or schools, right? You have education. Well, schools aren't good. Why don't we set up schools for profit, where private companies get paid per student to send people to schools? Or, we send the army to go out and fight our wars. Why don't we have these private companies that get guns and weapons and send people into conflict zones, right? And one example of this privatization is, the Metropolitan Transit Authority. A lot of people think the subways in New York are government. They're not. The MTA is a public beneficent corporation. Banks make profits of it. And you see kind of the rise of, people like to talk about crony capitalism, where things are private, but the government is facilitating a monopoly. So private companies are set up that make profits for corporations and for investors, but the government is facilitating it. And that seems to be almost a staple of neoliberalism. It's different than classical liberalism, which is the government does nothing. It's things that are done by the government are handed over to private corporations to make profits off of them. You have the deregulation of lending, and the famous housing bubble, 2007, 2008, where it suddenly became legal. All kinds of lending practices that had been completely illegal were being legalized in the lead up to the financial crisis, where you could take a mortgage on your house and it would be a certain amount for 2-3 years, and then the payment would be triple that, all of a sudden. And of course, people lost their homes in big numbers. Student loans, for example. Most industrialized countries allow, the government provides education. In the USA, the government facilitates the lending of money for people to get into student debt for the rest of their lives to pay for their education. So that's neoliberalism in the United States. And I just wanted to throw this in there. Advocates of neoliberalism will often talk about how they believe in freedom, right? They believe people should be totally free to do whatever they want, government hands off. Well, take a look at some of these memes you can find on the internet, right? They love Augusto Pinochet, and they think it's very funny that during the aftermath of his coup, he had a policy of, I guess not a policy, but some of his supporters were taking leftists and communists and throwing them out of airplanes and helicopters, right? And so it's become like this big joke, and you can see this is quite popular among advocates of neoliberalism. So, these folks believe in freedom. It seems like, what they want to do to people that disagree with them is a little bit different than just allowing them to have their free speech. So on that note, that ends section 3.